Cascadia is seeping methane gas from hundreds of streams underwater. It's linked to the seismology off the Washington coast. It's a subduction area, as we know. This is explained by NOAA and University of Washington. Cascadia margin methane seeps. An unknown amount of methane is fluxing through continental margins, and up to 5,000 gigatons of carbon are stored in icy methane hydrates deposits within their sediment. Sources of this methane include biogenic production, dissociation of the methane hydrate layers, and deep thermogenetic sources. Methane is one of the group of carbon species that have been recognized as important greenhouse gases, and thus the methane geochemical cycle is important to climate modeling. Only in the past several years has sonar technology been available to rapidly locate and map these submarine methane sources over large areas of the seafloor. The Cascadia margin is of particular interest because the methane is stored within the accretionary edge of the major subduction zone. It represents the geological end member that has a strong tectonic overprint, in contrast to the thickly sedimented passive margins represented in the United States Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico, which also have extensive methane seeps. There is increasing evidence for accumulation of seep derived carbon species, both from known seeps and in regional surface water along the Cascadia margin, which potentially has environmental impact on the upper water column. A baseline characterization of methane seeps along the Cascadia margin is critical to assess methane input into the water column, and it's timely because the continued rise in ocean temperatures could potentially impact the rate of release of methane from the hydrate layers into the ocean and possibly into the atmosphere. And the University of Washington has found, Hannah Hickey, University of Washington, reports that hundreds of bubbles stream links biology and seismology off Washington's coast, the Cascadia subduction zone. Off the coast of Washington, columns of bubbles rise from the seafloor as if evidence of a sleeping dragon lying below. But the bubbles are methane that's squeezed out of sediment and rises up through the water. The location where they emerge provide important clues to what will happen during a major offshore earthquake. The study from the University of Washington and Oregon State University was recently published in Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth. The first large-scale analysis of these gas emissions along Washington's coast finds more than 1,700 bubble plumes. They're separate plumes from which the bubbles are emitted, primarily clustered in the north-south band, about 30 miles from the coast. Analysis of the underlying geology suggests why the bubbles emerge here. The gas and fluid rise through fault lines generated by the motion of geologic plates that produce major offshore earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest. The leader of the article, Paul Johnson, University of Washington, professor of oceanography, says we found the first methane vents on the Washington margin in 2009, and we thought we were lucky to find them. But since then, the number has just grown exponentially. These vents are a little ephemeral. Sometimes they turn off and on with the tides, and they can move around a little bit on the seafloor. But they tend to occur in clusters within a radius of about 3 football fields. Sometimes you'll go out there and you'll see one active vent, and you go back to the same location, it's gone. They're not reliable, like the geysers at Yellowstone, for example. The authors analyzed data from multiple research cruises over the past decade that use modern sonar technology to map the seafloor and also create sonar images of gas bubbles within the underlying water. Their new results show more than 1,778 methane bubble plumes issuing from the waters off Washington state, grouped into 491 clusters. Johnson said if you were able to walk on the seafloor from Vancouver Island to the Columbia River, you would never be out of sight of a bubble plume. The sediments of the Washington coast are formed as the Juan de Fuca oceanic plate plunges under the North American continental plate, scrapping material off the ocean crust, and these sediments are then heated, deformed, and compressed against the rigid North American plate. The compression forces out both fluid and methane gas, which emerges as bubble streams from the seafloor. The bubble columns are located most frequently at the boundary between the flat continental shelf and the steeply sloping section where the seafloor drops to the abyssal depths of the open ocean. This abrupt change in slope is also a tectonic boundary between the oceanic and continental plates. Although there are some methane plumes from all depths on the margin, the vast majority of the newly observed methane plumes sites located at the seaward side of the continental shelf at about 160 meters water depth, Johnson said. A previous study from University of Washington suggested that warming seawater might be releasing frozen methane in this region, but further analysis showed the methane bubbles off the Pacific Northwest coast rise from sites that have been present for hundreds of years and are not related to global warming, Johnson said. Instead, these gas emissions are a long-lived natural feature, and their prevalence contributes to the continental shelf area being such productive fishing grounds. Methane from beneath the seafloor provides food for bacteria, which then produce large quantities of bacterial film. This biological material then feeds an entire ecological chain of life that enhances fish populations in those waters. Johnson said if you look online at where the satellite transponders show where the fishing fleet is, you can see clusters of fishing boats around these methane plume hotspots. To understand why the methane bubbles occur here, the authors use active geologic survey conducted by oil and gas companies in 1970s and 1980s. The surveys, now publicly accessible, show fault zones in the sediment where the gas and fluid migrate upwards until emerging from the seafloor. Seismic surveys over the areas with methane emissions indicate that the continental shelf edge gets thrust westward during a large megathrust earthquake, or magnitude 9 earthquake, Johnson said. Faults at this tectonic boundary provide the permeable pathway for methane gas and warm fluid to escape from deep within the sediments. The location of these faults could potentially provide new understanding of the earthquake hazard from the Cascadia subduction zone, which last ruptured more than 300 years ago. If the seafloor movement during a subduction zone earthquake occurs closer to shore, and a major component of this motion occurs within the shallow water, this would generate a smaller tsunami than if the seafloor motion were entirely in deep water. If your hypothesis turns out to be true, then that has a major implication for how the subduction zone works, Johnson said. This is by H. Paul Johnson et al., Anomalous Concentration of Methane Emissions at the Continental Shelf Edge of the North Cascadia Margin. This on phys.org. H.P. Johnson et al., Anomalous Concentration of Methane Emissions at the Continental Shelf Edge of the North Cascadian Margin, Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, from University of Washington. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.